Hey everybody, Will and Matt here from Downtown Activities with bonus action episode 10. Yeah. 10. And what we always do before this is sit down and look at our long list of subjects and try and decide what we want to talk about. Every once in a while we throw everything to the wind and come up with a different topic.
A different one that sounds good and we're excited about.
Quite often, what we decide to talk about is influenced by the discussions that you and I have just been having
organically
recently. Anyway, because what this podcast is essentially just taking one of our regular conversations and recording
filming it.
And a couple of days ago, you and I were talking about a couple of NPCs. One from Devils of the West campaign that we just recently ran back into, and one from an old campaign of mine. That have kind of a lot of similarities and fit into this category, and it just kind of fostered a discussion about a lot of this. So today we're going over gods, demigods, divine beings, all-powerful beings.
Patrons.
We're including Warlock Patrons in this. And obviously, when people are talking about, for the most part, gods and goddesses, and sort of all-powerful beings and stuff in, especially something like Tabletop RPG campaign, D&D for example, if it's a homebrew campaign, immediately it's like the thought there is sort of creating a pantheon, creating your swath of gods, and sort of deciding what those gods are like. How do you usually begin to approach that?
It is so setting specific. And it also is character specific too. I think an important thing, it's very similar to my approach to world building, which is if you're somebody who likes to write out entire histories and build up entire geopolitical quagmires of plot that may never be experienced, do it and have fun doing it. But if you don't, build what you need, not what may possibly feasibly exist. So in terms of a pantheon, you don't really need to build out your full pantheon for what I would say a majority of D&D campaigns. You need to build out enough that if religion or the gods are a big part of the story, that the ones who are players in that are decided on, as well as ones who kind of represent factions or something that might exist in the story. And then a lot of it also has to do with, what are your players playing? Do you have a cleric? What kind of cleric? Are they a cleric of a death god? Well, there better be a death god for them to follow, and then that'd be something I'd probably try and do collaboratively with the player and be like, what does your, like, if their character is like death god, like ball god of murder, and like they just want to go around and like get as many souls for the, blood for the blood god kind of death god, then that's the way I'm going to slate it. Where if it's more of like I exist as a bastion between life and death and make sure that people die in the right times, a la Raven Queen, I would build the god more in that vein. So I think, I guess, unless you're someone who just really enjoys building that kind of stuff, build what you need and what's relevant to your players, to your plot, and to factions that exist in your story.
Right, and obviously some of that depends a lot on, as you said, it's very setting specific, and that depends a lot on the size of the pantheon as well. If you're only talking about 4 or 5 gods, you should probably just go ahead and make all of them, even if you don't have sort of everything about them figured out, just so that their names sort of exist and they can be brought up. But if you're talking about something more like like ancient Greek religion, where it's like, I feel like even though I've been a fan of mythology my whole life, I feel like I'm still learning about Greek gods and goddesses that I just never knew existed. And it turns out that guy's just has this, he's in the same sort of realm as Demeter over here.
I mean, 90% of the Norse or Greek pantheon can be described as like Loki/Zeus got horny and slept with something, and then now this is a new Titan.
Yeah, especially when going
so-and-so got a headache and cracked his head open and a god fell out. Like, it's just, you can have that. Like I said, if you enjoy writing that, go for it. If you've got a weird enough brain for it. But I think it's a lot of time to fully flesh out a pantheon of that size, scope, and variety.
Right. So you're going to focus more on, orders of holy knights and their attached sort of patron god, or cults that are going to be important to the story, or sort of other religious factions like that that are going to be more likely to pop up in the world.
And then you get to focus your effort instead of having a full pantheon of shallow gods, you can
Right.
have a specific pantheon of really detailed orders where you know what the symbol is for them. You know the kind of main ideals that their followers would need to abide by. You know where in the world maybe that they're like, you can put that extra level of detail into it without and still be working time efficiently with
Right.
your prep work. So that's my personal approach on pantheons. I think that that's the better way to do it for the GM who wants to use their time well.
I think that's a very good point. I tend to do a kind of a little bit of everything. I mean, I tend not to make extremely large pantheons, just because I feel like I eventually start running out of sort of realms and powers to associate with the gods. But like the amount of work that I'm going to put into a pantheon, or like how much character I'm going to put into the gods, really depends on the size of it and how present they're going to be. In the very first big campaign that I ran, you guys encounter one god. Turns out he was this sort of friendly merchant that you were encountering a couple different times. And then he's revealed to be a god when he teleports you to the city outside of time.
Which is a long story that's hard to explain. True. I was there.
But, like, I didn't, apart from sort of deciding what he was going to be like as an NPC, I didn't really feel the need to, apart from wanting to have a little bit of sort of mythology and lore for the Pantheon as a whole, I didn't feel the need to characterize, like, all the rest of these gods, because you weren't going to be directly interacting with any of them unless you found a way to do so. And so you're absolutely right, there just wasn't any point in focusing my sort of energies in that direction. I tend to like to sort of build the whole Pantheon, but I don't try and build very large, convoluted ones. I just like to sort of have, like, leaving it sort of half built just feels like there's these very obvious holes in my prep work, and I just don't necessarily want to leave those.
The OCD parts of your brain are like, there's gaps in this pattern that I could fill, I should.
Yeah, well, and especially if it's like all I need to do is throw a name on it and, you know, what this is the god of. And I feel like building pantheons is an interesting exercise in building out how the cultures of your world view certain concepts and how they connect certain concepts. Because everybody tends to look at, like, it's like, oh, this is the god of the sun and the god of life and the god of plants, you know, and tend to sort of everyone tends to draw these sort of very similar cultural associations between a lot of concepts. And building your own pantheon is a very fun way to sort of play around with some of those. Like, not making the god of death this, like, evil old hideous crone, you know, that, like, everybody despises.
Or the skull-masked necro villain.
Right.
Who wants to just murder, death, kill everybody.
Necrovillain is a great stoner metal band.
I need to write that one down.
It's just a fun way to, like, you know, for example, like when Costigan and I were doing some world building on a thing a couple of years ago, one of the things, concepts about the world that we really settled on was the idea of kind of dichotomies, especially within magic. Like, if you're a fire mage, you're also either a water mage or an ice mage. Because in order to fully understand fire, you have to sort of understand its opposite. Okay. So, like, a light mage is also shadow mage. Like, knowing how to cast a spell is knowing how to counter it. Which is why, like, healers aren't necessarily viewed all that well in that world, because it's like, oh yeah, you know how to cure all these terrible wounds and terrible diseases, and you know how to just cause them with spells as well.
I cast leprosy.
Yes, exactly. You know, I cast your leg has been chopped off. Like, yeah, you know, it makes the magic system interesting, and so we made the gods the same way, where, like, each god is sort of the patron of two very dichotomous aspects, because in order to fully control one, you have to sort of fully control the other. And it makes that whole pantheon very interesting, and it makes worshippers within that pantheon a little more interesting as well, because like, if it's just something like, this is the god of fire and ice, then their worshippers probably aren't all that insane, but like, it's like, oh yeah, this whole cadre of, like, life priests are also kind of death priests, and that puts them in a more interesting place in the world.
That is very
and that's part of the reason that I like kind of building whole pantheons, is because it gives you a chance to begin to flesh out some of the sort of cultural worldviews within your little world. This is a really like sort of in-depth world building discussion, I guess.
Yeah.
But pantheons are a very easy way to begin to do some of that by just beginning to attach sort of odd concepts together.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also, I mean, a lot of the advice we were kind of giving at the start there is for a world where the gods either don't play a big role or only a few do.
Mm-hmm.
On the other end of that spectrum, you can have full stories and stuff that are really based around the divine, and in those worlds, that should be a lot of your effort.
Yes.
And even in ones where that's not the case, it doesn't really hurt to have at least loose ideas of the overall mindset, like you said, because it really helps describe a kind of a mindset and a way that the nations and stuff govern themselves, and the way, like, you can tell a lot about an ancient culture by its folklore and by its religious following. But yeah, going back to what I kind of started that sentence with, what do you think about a world or a story heavily based around the gods? What kind of changes to your prep does that bring in?
I mean, immediately I'm going to try and draw inspiration from stuff like Greek mythology, where the gods are much more active, and whoever your cast of characters are going to be like interacting with them a lot more often. That's obviously going to put a lot more focus on planning out that pantheon, and I'm going to then put the same amount of effort into those gods and goddesses as I would into important NPCs, because that's essentially what they're becoming at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, it goes a little beyond just like names and what they control, and going into personality, their relationships with other gods. If gods are siblings, do they get along? Do they not get along?
Probably not.
If gods are married, do they get along or not get along?
Are they Greek? Not. Probably not.
It changes the focus away from them just being these sort of nebulous sort of names and realms of power, and being characters.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you still need to do your regular like pantheon work, but you then need to put a lot more work into making them all unique, and making them all have kind of their own, especially if you're taking inspiration from ancient mythology, they all have to sort of have their own faults and foibles and stuff like that, because the Greek pantheon is a very flawed group of
each one
characters.
Is a god of a domain as well as a mental health disorder, if you ask me.
It absolutely does feel that way, and that's partially just reflecting how a lot of ancient cultures viewed themselves and viewed the world.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to put some of that same level of work in your characters. You don't necessarily need to write a massive book of mythology,
no,
all about your gods and goddesses, because ideally it will be your players writing those stories, in their interactions with the gods. But that gives you a lot of fun opportunities, having gods be very present characters, because especially as the gods and the characters become familiar with each other, all of a sudden it's not just Zeus banging his way through the nobility of ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm.
There's a group of characters having to try and clean up the mess he makes, and it just like leaves behind, and you're constantly running into demigods, and like the characters meeting somebody who looks suspiciously like their friend Zeus, who's trying to find his father, who left his mother when he was born, and is this man of great strength.
Mm-hmm.
Puts these characters in this wonderful position of like, do we tell him? Like, do we tell him his dad's kind of a dick? Like,
but also the god, like the god.
Like we know him, and like we've spent a lot of time in jail because of the antics he's pulled. Like, it gives rise to a lot of fun opportunities, but you do have to approach them more through the guise as NPCs and like true characters than just as these sort of nebulous forces.
And I would say that bridges even for less interaction with the gods or fewer gods interacting with the world kind of campaigns. I think a really good like just bite of advice from this you could take is don't treat your gods like nebulous forces, treat them like NPCs. Give them characteristics, give them flaws, give them ideals, and not just, I'm a god of death, so my ideal is death. Like, I'm a god of death, my ideal is that people should die when the time is right for them to die, and anyone who does elsewise is in direct contrast with what I believe. But I'm also somebody who's, if it's in a world where the gods interact, like somebody who is, it's like this god or goddess who's like very interested in the affairs of the world and like wants to be a part of life because they see this like life-death dichotomy so interesting, like they want to feel what life is like because they're always so used to the coldness of death. And that's a very interesting feature that they have. And now like they enter into human form and you could find the goddess of death dancing at a festival just to feel a little bit of what life is like.
Well, and that's going to, if you're a person who does build histories and sort of creation stories and stuff into the worlds, those characteristics are going to influence a lot of that. Like, you know, how the world was created should be sort of directly related to the personalities of all those gods and goddesses, and events of past history should be directly related to that. And characterizing your gods, whether they're sort of active characters or not, is especially important if you have characters like clerics or paladins in your party, characters who either have some sort of direct communion with a higher power,
or divine soul sorcerers, or zealot barbarians,
and warlock patrons,
whatever the holy warlock is called.
And warlock patrons across the board, I think, are another just good example of this, because we've always really, and we were talking about this just before we started recording. We've tended to have a problem in the past where we feel like our warlock patrons haven't been active enough in the world, haven't been like true characters. We were using the example of, everybody's at a party and Cthulhu rises up out of the punch bowl. And, the whole party screams in terror and flees, except for the one hooded guy in the... Yeah. Oh, I'd try the shrimp on your way out. Why are you here? And then Cthulhu sends you off on some great quest. Like, your patron should be actually... Like, you should be going on missions for your patron, and your patron, like, there should be a little bit of back and forth there. And a lot of times, I think clerics and paladins should a little bit kind of be the same way. Have your cleric characters receive visions.
Oh yeah.
Or dreams. Have your paladin being constantly guided by this, this sort of this feeling that only like. Or this music that only he hears that is guiding him towards some deed. Like, we've just kind of done this way too often across the board of make clerics and make paladins and make warlocks, and they might be interesting characters in and of themselves, but they're not interacting with a very interesting part of their class in the way that they should. So learn from our mistake and
do what we're trying to do better at.
Yes, and do that. Make especially if you have those kinds of classes or those archetypes. And really, it's fun to have gods speak to non-cleric characters as well, and that can begin to either foster a multi-class or foster them towards like.
Your fighter can wear a holy symbol too. You don't have to be a cleric to have a holy symbol. I think it was 25 gold or something, 15, something like that.
At most 25.
Go buy a nice necklace and hope that the god gives you some fortune. It's funny you mentioned the back and forth, and I think that's another often overlooked, and that is the wheel and woe, as it were, the gods showing up because they have boons for you or quests for you. But also, if you act in contrast to the ideals of your god or your patron, there should be negatives to that. And I think it's something that we don't want to like take away class features and stuff like that from players as a game master, because that's not fun. But if you're like cleric of the all shiny good god of love and life is like murdering and pillaging, there should be like a literal come to Jesus moment there.
Jesus come to you.
Jesus coming to you and being like there should be, if you're wanting to avoid like the feels bad of it, then like give them a chance and have it be like the god, like they receive these haunting visions from their god that like the path they're on is not one of their order. And if they continue to act like a bunch of murder hobos and they continue to feed into that, then like all of a sudden they then try and cast a healing spell on themselves and it doesn't work.
Well, and that's partially just a playgroup problem too, right? Is you know, people are always going to stray a little bit one direction or another from their character, but human beings do that as well. So like that's not necessarily a bad thing. And if those arcs are sort of gentle enough or realistic enough one direction or another, characters can completely change, and a lot of characters should. But yeah, if a character, especially a character that is drawing their power from some supernatural being that has a very sort of set list of do's and don'ts, characters breaking that should be something that both the characters and like in sort of an in-game sense the god or the divine being is aware of
and cares about,
and and that was part of the point of like kind of the piety system that was introduced in Theros Beyond Death, which I think was a very interesting idea. The idea of even non-religious characters, or not necessarily non-religious characters, but like non-religious classes, sort of being able to do favors for gods and become followers of gods and get sort of boons and bonuses along that route. And it's just one of those things again that makes the world feel a little more alive. It feels like it's responding to players' decisions. If a religious class character is devotedly following the teachings of their god or is breaking those teachings, the world should be responding to that at least a little bit.
Yeah, it should care. And I think that some of that can be like a toxic player or something who's like, I'm going to play the life cleric, but I'm just going to murder people. Ha ha lol. Like, if that's the person you're playing with, then have a talk with them. If they won't grow up, then kick them out of your group. That's kind of my harsh opinion there, if that's not the game you're wanting to play.
This is a game that should be fun for everybody.
Yeah.
If it's not being fun for everybody,
because of one person,
remove the source of the problem.
But it's not always that like acting in antithesis to your patron especially can oftentimes be a like morally positive character choice. Like if you're a warlock of a like evil fiendish deity and you go out of your way to save like a holy divine being, or you something like there should be a like disappointment from an evil patron as well that can come through, and like your character should have to like weigh those odds. And like if your character wants to like have that heroic moment, it seems like it's punishing them for being morally good, but it's really like it is helping show the gravity of the decision they made, and that like they put themselves behind whatever this problem was. And this is more important than me. I will risk my power and my source of my power to try and do the right thing here because it's what's the right thing.
Well, and people making D&D characters all too often, and I know I fall into this trap all the time, sort of ignored the name of archetypes or the theme of subclasses just because of the list of... It's like, man, okay. It's like, I want the list of powers. I don't, like... I'm not actually an assassin. Yeah. Which, by and large, is fine. There's really nothing wrong with that. But more... It can be a little harder to ignore that with stuff like Warlock or Cleric in particular. And at the very least, like, just reflavor it.
Yeah, I was going to say, the advice there is don't not use it, just replace it.
Yeah,
find something logical
to make an interesting character and to make sure that like at least hopefully those conflicts are as far between as possible between like your Warlock patron not letting you use your magic on something good but you having to do it or wanting to do it. You can at least minimize those conflicts, but it can give rise to interesting storytelling moments and. It's entirely possible. It can be a bit of a nuisance, but it's entirely possible to switch Warlock patrons.
And it's entirely possible to hunt down and kill your current Warlock patron, as we learned in the big first D&D campaign I ran. And this is another thing: is like that character arc transition. If you have a character start with a really negative, evil patron, but their character tends to kind of go and slant towards a more positive bend. You can set the story up in a way that they can free themselves either through the destruction or the like just changing of patrons of their previous patron. You should give an option for that so that they can like with ours we had a character who was a fiend warlock technically. We kind of reflavored it to just be like an evil undead sort of
Kind of a lich.
Kind of a lich, really. And there was this moment where, like, the lich is evil and a part of this negative problem, and this warlock decides to go against them, and you guys went and hunted down, found the home, and fought and killed their warlock patron. And during that fight, partway through, like, right when the fight starts, all of a sudden this warlock can hardly do any of the powers that this warlock has, because the person who gives him those powers are who he's shooting them at. But then partway through, a different entity offers powers to him, and he takes that, and now all of a sudden he has these new and different abilities and can use those to fend off his previous patron, and that starts the next arc of that character.
It just works better if, to swing back around to a previous point, if the patrons or these divine beings are characters. If they're not just these sort of nebulous just names. And that can work fine, because quite often gods aren't a huge part of D&D campaigns, and they don't necessarily have to be. And that can be an interesting thing just about the world, that, like, maybe most people, you know, only sort of half believe in the gods, because, like, they've never met an actual cleric who could, you know, call down upon, you know, the power of the gods and raise the dead or whatever. So they're just, like, most people are probably kind of ambivalent about the gods, like, yeah, the church are a bunch of, like, they're annoying, but they have a lot of power.
Like, I prayed and it rained, and then I prayed and it didn't rain. Seems like it just kind of rains sometimes and doesn't other times.
I've never met a person with actual holy magic, and then that makes actual clerics interesting. That makes people actually sort of truly in communion with the gods, more interesting characters. When all of a sudden there is a priest wandering village to village, healing people, you know, by some divine power. It like you can absolutely get by with the gods not being true characters, and a lot of campaigns they probably won't be. But if they're going to really show up at all, actually characterizing them is really going to give you a lot of bang for your buck, I think.
I think it's a valuable use of your time, and just will make them more interesting and more human, which is a funny, like more relatable and more real as individuals instead of just these great nebulous beings.
But it makes them easier to understand for the players and for characters in the world, and that can be a valuable thing. You know, it's sort of making them a little more relatable, or at least aspects of them relatable. And then that makes the ones that are sort of truly unrelatable or truly unknowable stand out and makes them kind of weird.
The great Cthulhu unimaginable horror. If every god is that, then Cthulhu's not that interesting.
Right.
The next, I think, kind of natural leap for this conversation is kind of the conversation that spawned us wanting to have this conversation, which is talking about divine or semi-divine beings in a game and what interactions they have with the players, specific interactions, and how they affect the story in the world, and how to limit that to avoid hurt feelings.
Yes, as well as being careful about, because this is actually something that I think about consistently when I'm planning any tabletop RPG, is like it's part of the reason that I never wanted in when I was running the Star Wars campaign that was like the first gameplay thing that ever kind of appeared on the channel. Why I never wanted you guys to interact with any like actual named NPCs. Or like named NPCs that are canon to Star Wars, because I've just played enough RPGs with enough different people to know that, like,
we're going to shoot Han Solo.
You've got about a 50-50 shot of any NPC you introduce surviving till the end of the session. And that goes for, like, canon, like NPCs. And, you know, and I wanted to cause as few, anomalies in space-time as possible.
Yeah.
But not having, you guys shoot Han Solo. And gods and divine beings can kind of be the same way, because, again, it's like, I give it a 50-50 shot of players just trying to kill them. And that's a kind of a, like, standing by your threats as a DM conversation.
Which is another topic at some point.
But, yeah, like, divine, like, sort of, you know, divine beings or, like, all-knowing beings are very hard to have characters interact with without giving too much away or just making characters annoyed. players around a D&D table, or just any tabletop RPG, get really annoyed by problems they can't solve.
Mm-hmm.
Even if some problems are meant to be sort of unsolvable.
It's not just, like, the frustrating piece for a player, I think, there is not that the problem is very, very unlikely for them to be able to solve successfully. It's that it literally can't be done.
Right.
It's like there's not a way I can creatively throw an idea at this that could work. It's just something that exists outside of my scope. Like, I can't.
And players don't like that. Unwinnable fights can be fine. You know, fights that are more chases than combats can work great. And honestly, it's another thing you should just have in your DM toolbox is these sort of running set piece battles that are more about like covering ground and clearing obstacles than they are about like killing the dragon. But like the sort of unwinnable fights can be fine, but players really don't like something that is truly beyond them to that scale. And not every problem within a D&D campaign is going to be solved by any means, but I was worried about that. One of the characters that were sort of specific talking about here was this sort of blind witch in a campaign of mine from back in the day named Bavrula, who showed up mysteriously pretty constantly at a lot of important story events. It gave some kind of like, the story quest is in that direction.
But she kind of did it like that direction sort of way, not to be poetic and not super specific.
Right. And part of the point of that, and then she ends up being the sort of magical MacGuffin that is this like source of ultimate power that you guys spend the whole campaign hunting. She's the one who takes it at the end. It just vanishes. And that was always sort of what she was supposed to be. It was this very mysterious, all-knowing figure that just like, no, you're never sure what her power actually is. Mm-hmm. She just shows up like sort of impossibly quite often. And I was really worried a couple of times in the middle of that campaign that I was like, that it was taking away from you in particular, like your enjoyment of the campaign. Like, your character had such a like almost bordering on antagonistic relationship with her the whole time that I was really worried that it was like that it was like
a negative thing for me as a player.
Yes, like actually like you sitting at the table, it was impacting your like experience of playing through the game.
I will take that as a compliment of my role play because I enjoyed her quite a bit as a player, but she was the perfect NPC for my character to despise because of the fact that the character I was playing in that was this like very know-it-all, like this person who felt like they could solve every problem if they had enough time and resources, and she was a problem unsolvable in their mind, but not really like something that he could fairly quantitate as a problem. Like he couldn't really say, like she wasn't really a threat, and she was helpful, but she was smarter than him, which no one else was in his eyes, and that irritated him, and he knew she was smarter than him. And she was helpful, but in a way that showed that she had her own like ends in sight too, that he didn't fully comprehend or understand. And he, like, anyone smarter than him or making him feel like he doesn't understand the situation made him angry and made him frustrated. And so I think that it was honestly very fun and helped me roleplay my character to have that kind of an NPC to be across from. And I think it added a lot for all the other players at the table too. Like, I think they enjoyed seeing Hadrian get antagonized and frustrated by that.
I do think other people liked watching Hadrian get unsettled by something because that wasn't something they really got to see.
It's like at any other nothing point got under Hadrian's skin. If it did, he figured out an efficient plan to remove it. Mm-hmm. But she was that splinter that he did not have tweezers fine enough to pull out, and he kept trying to hone the right tweezers, and she disappeared with the all-powerful source of magic before he ever got close.
But it's very difficult. It's characters like that, especially characters that are going to be active NPCs. And gods absolutely run into the same issue as well. And honestly, this is part of the reason that I've never liked playing in the established D&D settings, is that if all-powerful characters exist in your world, why aren't they the ones solving the problems? Mm-hmm. Like, that's something you have to consider as a DM. In the case of the Greek gods, it's mostly the Greek gods causing the problems, and the Greek gods don't get along. If you've ever actually read the Iliad, that's most of the Iliad is the gods kind of at war, which helps to explain why, this whole battle is being fought, before the walls of Troy. But, like, they're quite often, either the gods are just like, you mortals can sort it out. I believe in you, buddy.
I can't be, but you go deal with it.
Or,
whatever.
Or they're those sort of just nebulous, just names that you never interact with directly, so then it just doesn't really become a consideration. But if all-powerful characters exist in your world, that's something that you, as a storyteller, have to decide. Why aren't they the ones just solving these problems?
And if they're the ones causing these problems, how is it possible to stop them?
Yes. And I think, like in Bavrula's case, it was mostly kind of out of a sense of amusement. Watching, like, she could have just, like, she really could have just, sort of ended everything near the beginning, but it's like, it's more interesting for her to, as this sort of all-knowing being, to just watch you all, go through the motions of, like, and especially Hadrian, like, thinking he's the hottest shit on earth. Like, watch him save the world.
This might be me thinking about Bavrula again, putting me back in the mindset of Hadrian and becoming an arrogant, lawful neutral prick. But part of my internal dialogue, what Hadrian tells himself to sleep at night, is that it wasn't so much toying with us as it was an amusement for her to assist us just enough to keep us going in the right path and stuff. But that for some reason, at some level, she needed us to be the one to open that box and get the MacGuffin for her. That if she could have just walked in and grabbed it and walked away, she would have. And so I think in his own headcanon, whether it's true or not, he says he thinks that us as a group needed to get to the point where we could do this for her, whatever her eventual end goal is.
It is entirely possible that's the case. She wasn't a god, like, as powerful as she was, or sort of all-knowing as she was. And where the MacGuffin spent most of its time was, sort of locked away by the powers of a god. But, like, that character's very difficult, and I wanted to stray away with Bavrula of, like, having that feel of, like, doing anything in Waterdeep, where it's like, there's
5 20th level characters there.
And it's like, for most of them, it's like literally their job to deal with this kind of stuff. Why are all of us level 3 schmuckos dealing with this?
They can snap their finger and the big bad evil guy dies in front of them. Like, why am I trying desperately to fight him?
Like, it just, like, there's just always kind of a disconnect there. Which is, like, homebrew worlds can kind of fix that, or if those types of characters exist, it's easier to explain. Either they're just too arrogant or too busy just fighting each other to deal with the world's problems, or who knows what. But, like, you just have to consider why all powerful beings exist in your world, but they're not the ones
solving or causing the problems.
Yeah.
I'd like to break it down to kind of 2 camps. We'll start with the Bavrula side, because that's what we were just talking about. Then we'll go to the Scratch side after that. Okay. Overall, benevolent, all-powerful or near all-powerful beings, what characteristics would you give them, and what would you do with the way they interact with the players to avoid players getting frustrated? I think to start, the big one for me is that made Bavrula work fairly well is benevolent but detached, in a sense that she's giving us help towards the overall positive end goal, but she's not so benevolent and kind and goodly that she's doing everything in her power to assist us, making it easy and her just handing us the answer to every riddle in our path.
I think the other direction you kind of lean with that is leaning more towards neutral than benevolent, but allied with the characters for whatever reason. I think it's also good to have the actual interactions those characters have, or the actual sort of advice those characters give, or the like the powers those characters show off, be very, like, quite limited, or quite few and far between. It's better to have this mysterious, all-powerful witch who clearly has some of her own goals going on show up very rarely to offer some advice, to unlock a door, to point the characters in one direction or another, rather than them being an NPC that follows the party around. Because then you just begin to rely on them to just solve every problem.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if they just show up whenever, and it's sort of few and far between, and the players never know where that character is going to show up, that helps to limit the amount of, I guess, damage that they're going to do.
Limiting their power to, or at least what power is shown. You mentioned that, and I think we should dive just a little deeper in it for a second. Something that made Bavrula work in my mind is that she seemed very powerful in a very loose and undescribable sense, not in a very real, visceral, in-your-face sense. She could appear randomly and had lots of information and knowledge clearly that showed that she was beyond the scope of a mortal being. But it wasn't her showing up and calling down fire from the heavens. It wasn't her eradicating armies with a swipe of a hand. It was her being there when a second ago she wasn't, which is weird and unsettling, and then her coming up and saying something super cryptic but valuable that shows she has knowledge outside of what a mortal being does.
Or making direct reference to things that she shouldn't know.
Exactly. And that shows a level of knowledge and power that can show, like, give the players the, like, wow, okay, this person is a scale above what I would expect a human being to be able to be, without it being like, haha, I'm dead, haha, explosion, I'm all, like, you don't have Tim pointing every second and making things explode all around him just to prove how powerful he is.
And as far as I remember, I don't know if Bavrula ever did any real magic apart
she never
from
cast a spell, I don't think.
Apart from, like, just like appearing behind you when no one was looking, and even like across impossible distances, and having knowledge she should not possibly have had. Which, again, it what you're aiming for is that feeling of kind of mystery and, like, this is some sort of understandable, all-powerful being. Like, I don't fully know what's going on here, but you don't, want them to just rain down fire from the heavens. It kind of goes back to Deus Ex Machina kind of conversations, where it just feels like some sort of just, like, impossible event occurring to just save the party just doesn't feel great for everybody. And that's why, like, what D&D is a hard magic system by and large, because you have spell slots, you have a list of spells, and obviously there are rules for kind of creating some of your own spells and stuff like that, but, like, the rules are very established by and large. Which means a player or an NPC creatively using a spell to get everybody out of trouble is cool and fun and is this great kind of reveal moment, but doesn't have that same just, like, kind of hand-wavy bullshit.
The spell doesn't exist, but they're more powerful than any mortal being, so they've just done this thing that doesn't exist in a quantifiable way in the rules because they're special and they're this powerful thing and they showed up and saved you. And then you're just like, then you feel like you don't. Very rarely do you want your characters to feel like the damsel. You want them to feel like the hero.
Yes.
And that kind of NPC hand-wave Deus Ex deity is very hand-wavy feeling a lot of the time.
And that's what you want to avoid. But with for the most part, with it can be a little bit easier with sort of patrons and gods, because people sort of understand the nature of them a little bit better. So following Zeus around on his, drunken amorous travels through the world, just having to, like, clean up after him and just, like, try and do damage control, and watching him just strike somebody with lightning isn't going to, like, come across the same way. The players are not necessarily going to be expecting it, but it's going to be sort of understandable to them.
And it's not really directly affecting them. And the other thing is, I think it's easier to have boons be granted from gods and patrons than it is from omnipotent, present physical beings. Because the thing that, like, here's a good example. A fight that's nearing the end and you are barely maybe going to win or barely maybe going to lose, and it's neck and neck, and it's this terrible combat that the dice haven't worked well or whatever, and then, like, your god shows up and kills the boss for you. That's lame. That's not cool. That's like, okay, he's just saving us. But your character who's been on this holy quest and is, like, super devout, suddenly, like, nearing the end, and then like one of like they feel the warmth of their god and a 3rd level spell slot comes back, and they get to cast like a big healing spell and like give the party just enough juice to overcome. Feels like them being rewarded, and it's them doing the action that saves them. There might be a kind of hand wavy or Deus Ex spell slot gift that the DM is giving the player, but it feels earned, and then it feels like the characters are... You never want the characters to feel like the backup to your NPC in being the heroes or the centerpiece of the story. It just that doesn't make you feel cool as a player. That doesn't make you excited. You want your players to be the stars of the show.
Especially when it comes to stuff like problem solving or combats.
Yes. They need to be the star of the show.
Yeah. It's because even if the players are sort of taking the role of background characters and they're just sort of following another character or another NPC through a quest, that's fine, especially if... Because, A, you get the kind of peanut gallery effect, which can be a lot of fun for players to just riff on everything that, an NPC is doing. Like an NPC that's, like, better than them, but also worse than them. Like, you get the peanut gallery effect, you get, and you get them solving all the problems in the background while this character is sort of the center of attention. But it's not
causing those problems.
Exactly. But it's not them. Like, it's not this thing just winning every combat for them. This thing just solving every problem for them. We've talked a lot about, like, both on this episode and other episodes, how players don't like unwinnable problems, and players don't like we were talking about the sort of Grimo Wormtongue thing. Like, NPCs like that, your players are going to despise, especially if they can't kill them. If they don't have a way of getting rid of them, it's like this. We could totally kill this guy. He's so much weaker than us, and he's directly in our path. He's causing us so much trouble, and there's nothing we can do about it. Players despise that kind of thing, which can be a valuable storytelling tool, but you don't want to build it into your quests and your combats and stuff.
When that thing is a deity who's literally impossible to interact with, that can also be magnified.
That problem becomes much worse if it's some sort of all-powerful building, which is almost how I feel about Scratch. As we've been talking about him. He's the 666 real deal Scratch.
Scratch is so. We'll go to the other side of this conversation, which is the kind of malevolent being who is this all-powerful thing that the players can interact with. And in our Devils of the West, there's a NPC that the players have, the time of this coming out with, have interacted with once, as you have all seen, but technically as what is recorded, they've recently gotten to have another little talk with him. And Scratch may or may not be the actual devil. And this story very much deals with, like, divine and evil forces and gothic horror elements and stuff like that. And in
it's a gothic horror western.
Yeah, and the character of Scratch is this kind of smooth talking, creepy Knight Rider who shows up and kind of antagonizes the players with cryptic, weird, creepy conversation.
Oh, and always in the friendliest of manners.
And he's friendly. He refers to everybody as friend, and like he speaks kindly, and he speaks to everyone in the party like they're an old pal. Some of them they are, but that's beside the point. But he is this kind of intangible, unbeatable evil in a party of monster hunters who are trying to battle the wicked evils. He's like the source of evil, showing up and saying hi to them. And he was a risky decision to make as a GM because of that.
I don't think he's a bad decision. He doesn't annoy me. It is one of those things that runs me ragged a little bit, just because like I know this is something completely beyond us. Like we can't deal with this. We can't reach max level in this campaign and then have a quick draw contest with him.
Yeah.
And kick his ass in combat. Like, that's just not an option. But the two reasons that I think Scratch works are that friendliness. Because he doesn't... I mean, it would work as well if he was the sort of Statler and Waldorf, like from the Muppets. Just like constantly heckling and insulting. Exactly. Like, that could work as well, but part of what makes him work is the friendliness. And it makes him more off-putting as well.
Creepy friendly is worse than just creepy.
Yes, and the amount of, obviously, like, knowledge that he has. And the other reason that he works is that we've never been in true direct conflict with him.
Mm-hmm.
We just assume he's the devil. He makes references that strongly imply he's the devil. We've encountered him twice. It's sort of implied he's had a hand in some of the stuff that we've been dealing with. But he's never, like, every, quest we've been on, every story we've dealt with, has never sort of directly, truly involved him.
Mm-hmm.
We've been able to solve each problem we've come up against. We can win each combat, we can get this object exercised, we can get this knowledge we need. So, like, Scratch works in that it's the same way where it's like you can't have all-powerful good beings showing up to solve all your problems. You can't have all-powerful evil beings
being the problem,
showing up to directly be the problem. And the story so far hasn't been us, busting into the mayor's house because he's a mad scientist experimenting on a young kidnapped werewolf to find the devil.
Spoiler
there
alert.
And then for like the first 3 episodes.
If you haven't watched the first 3, rewind and don't listen for the 5 seconds before now. But there's a lot more interesting stuff. Watch Devils of the West. It's a lot of fun.
It has been a lot of fun.
Back to your point.
But we didn't bust in there only to surprise the devil in the mayor's study and he turns to smoke and blows away up the chimney or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he hasn't been there really for any of the actual encounters we've had. And that's part of the reason that he works, is that it's kind of implied he's involved, he shows up, he's creepy every once in a while, but in the actual day-to-day workings and story of the campaign, he's not a piece of it.
He's involved the way that a blacksmith is involved in an assassination. He crafts the dagger that person tries to stab you with, but if you stab the assassin before he stabs you, he's not going to intervene. He's this source of all evil, but he's so detached and uninterested in actually interacting with it after the fact. And I think that the big thing that makes him work is that he's really not as the source of evil. If he is the true devil, as the source of all evil, he is obviously your enemy. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he doesn't have any interest in working against you guys. He, without giving away too much of the plans of the devil, he's not interested in stopping you guys from doing what you're doing. That's not his goals. He has goals outside of that and very tailored and individual to each one of you. If the devil is as the devil is portrayed to be, his goal isn't to kill the world with all of his evil monsters and demons. His goal is to corrupt people and make people do wrong things. And if his monsters can help people do that, then that works well for him. But that's not his goal, and he wants to work with you guys. You don't want to work with him. And again, following that same thing of the devil can't force you to do anything. You as mortal beings have your own free choice. He's just going to do everything he can to help tip the scale and give you slanted advice to try and help you roll in a way that meets his ends. And you, as players, still have total agency, and that's really important. He's not casting a mind control spell on you and making you go commit sinful deeds. He's saying weird, cryptic advice pretending to be a friend, and you guys can say, you're creepy, I'm going to go have a bad dream and then try and forget that this happened, and then go on and do everything the way you would anyways.
Well, and it's not, he's not the one walking through the graveyard raising people as ghouls.
Mm-hmm.
It's... it's and really that's the fine line that you have to run with any sort of all-powerful being. It gets a little bit easier with gods, but it's still a risk. Is just how much they're going to actually interact with the events of the story, and sort of as a part of that, how much, not necessarily how much power they have, but how much power they show off. Mm-hmm. It's much more effective to hint at power, because Scratch has done, apart from having knowledge he shouldn't have, has done literally nothing.
He's done nothing a mortal man couldn't do.
Unless that was his hand that came out of the molten metal to grab the amulet.
That could have been a trick of the light.
Exactly. But we don't see him again calling down fire, or performing anything like that. He works because he's not directly involved. He's there. He has sort of some commentary on the story. He's sort of related to things going on, but he's not. He's not himself, a part of all of the combats that we've had or all the storylines that we've had. And that's what made, on the opposite end of things, Bavrula sort of work, was that, like, she was never present for a single combat that you guys fought. She shows up every once in a while, either giving some advice or being disappointed at a decision you've made, specifically a decision you've made.
What do you mean? Save the world? You're welcome. Sorry, Hadrian coming out again.
But she's like, and she's sort of, it's sort of hinted that she's this all-powerful being, but she's not, she's never really shown using that power, and she's never, like, sort of truly a part of any of the individual sort of story nodes or quests that are going on. And that's, by and large, the best way to do it. If your Warlock Patron Cthulhu is showing up and sending you out on quests, he shouldn't be the one doing the quests. No. He's got you to do the legwork for it. And it's sort of funnier if you don't fully understand why he's even got you doing some of the quests in the first place.
Especially if it's something like Cthulhu that's weird and
like
unimaginable.
Like your Warlock Patron having the Warlock do even mundane sort of odd things is fun and can help to paint the patron in a certain light.
What if your patron is some, like, the Fathom with some, like, weird creature being or something like that, and it basically sends your warlock on a quest to do his grocery list?
Exactly.
But the grocery list of a deity or a patron is some weird elaborate thing, but it's this list of things that he needs, and it's like, what sort of horrible magics? And then you get there and Cthulhu makes a big stew out of it and it's like, perfect.
Or it's even funnier if it's completely mundane things. You know what I mean? It's like Cthulhu has you, like, Cthulhu wants a ship full of bananas. And they're like, a full. And you're like, and the players are like, how big of a ship? Where do we get that many bananas? Where do we take it? Like he told us to get him a ship full of bananas.
Something like that could be very wacky and fun.
And it goes back to just, like, conversations we've had before about putting serious characters in goofy situations, but
warlocks tend to be very edgy, serious characters, so that is a fun thing.
But it's your Warlock Patrons, your gods, unless, like, you either need to have a very good reason as to why the gods or these divine beings aren't the ones directly involved solving the problems, or they can't be sort of directly attached to those problems at all. If your whole D&D campaign is just a story about a war between two kingdoms, for the most part, what do the gods care? Unless it's like, unless this kingdom is the source of true evil and them winning will corrupt all of existence. It's like it sort of makes sense that, like, there might be clerics on both sides. There might be, warlocks on both sides. But, like, by and large, the gods are staying out of the fight because both they don't
sides,
care.
Yeah, it's not something that affects them.
It's present and important to the characters. Exactly. It's present and important to the characters, especially if things personal to them are being threatened by this war. But the gods are beyond it.
Another big piece of advice I would give with, especially in terms of the Bavrula, the Scratch, the omnipotent or semi-omnipotent NPC that the characters interact with, is use it sparingly or not at all if you are not willing to either put a lot of prep work in or feel like you are a very comfortable and confident off-the-cuff role player. Because role-playing a omnipotent or all-knowing character is very like playing Scratch. There's some notes and stuff I've done before, but there is, like, apart from some Hadrian moments, I don't think I've had a more challenging role-playing experience than role-playing Scratch, because having to maintain this era of, like, he doesn't work if he's not creepy and unsettling and always being friendly but saying, like, friendly, threatening things, and you have to keep that energy about you the whole time and be able to respond fairly quickly to keep that feeling there. And if you have, like, the omnipotent, all-knowing character show up and be like, and you have that moment where you're having to, like, backpedal and think of stuff, that'll be lost a lot, I think, on your players. And it can be avoided by, like, if the idea is that, similar with, like, Scratch's first meeting with you guys, if he's kind of showing up and he's got something to say to each of you, having that written out is a really good idea. And then it's just on you to kind of transition from one to the next. that's how it was for the first meeting with Scratch. The second meeting with Scratch, he didn't have like advice or really specific things to say to you. He just had what I knew as the game master had transpired in the story to kind of use as fuel to say things to you guys. And I had to I'm pretty confident and comfortable in that place to keep rolling with that kind of stuff. But I've been DMing this game for years and years now, or games like this at least. And so I felt like I could do that, and it went, I think, overall well. But if you're new to this, like it was very challenging to me, and I don't know if I did it as well as I could have in those moments because it's such a challenging thing. So set yourself up for success, make those moments sparing, few and far between, and put the effort in beforehand so that they sound smart and interesting and creepy in the moment.
As well as limit the advice that they're giving. Cryptic advice is better. And just like small amounts of advice, few and far between, is better. Part of the problem is just that players very rarely do what you expect them to do. If you're a good DM and you know your play group, you can, at least in certain situations and with certain NPCs and stuff, you can absolutely set things up for them to take a certain path.
Which could be another conversation we have on here about how to do that.
And that's a very challenging thing to do, even if you know your play group. But it is entirely possible to do. I know you well enough that based off of like the character you make, I can quite often have kind of a rough idea of the path you're going to take. Sort of in approaching in certain problems or when certain opportunities are presented. But players very rarely do what you expect them to do. So it's very hard to have an NPC that accurately predicts the future unless what they're predicting are events that are beyond the player's control.
I think a good example of that was also in Devils of the West. Check it out now. With a character who you guys went to that's very weird and creepy. He's seemingly like knows more than a mortal man, but not really, and is like he's definitely not an omnipotent, all-powerful kind of an NPC, but he kind of falls into this with like a prophetic character who the prophetic vision he gives you is of something that won't change by your decisions. His advice, his thing is a pre-existing thing that's just, without going into any spoilers of the story, like it is something that exists as a part of the problem or part of what you're looking for, that's there before you ever show up and doesn't change because you got there and did something. And so that being there is always going to be true. It's less about him telling the future. It's more about him describing something that you haven't experienced yet.
Yes.
It's already there. It's already decided. You just haven't walked to that zone and had it load for you yet.
Yes.
To put it in a video game sense.
And it's absolutely possible to have NPCs describe locations that the characters are going to go at some point but haven't been yet, describe NPCs they're going to meet, or describe story events that are beyond their control, to hint at an assassination at a wedding or whatever else, because they're events that are beyond the player's control. The problem with like sort of omnipresent, omniscient characters is it can be hard to have some of those conversations with players because like you just never know how the dice are going to fall. You never know what the players are going to do next. So it's very hard to give them some of that advice. It's fun to have Bevrula hinting that this enemy that you're after is closer than you would think. It's someone you've met. Because she knows full well who it is. She just wants to. What she wants is what I want, which is that moment where you're standing alone in Costavian's office, and you find a broken mirror like in the side room of the office, and an event from one of the first 3 or 4 sessions of the campaign comes back and clicks together, and it's just this like, and it's this fun moment for this character who's supposed to be this kind of great detective, like standing there and putting all the pieces together, and then just rushing out of the office because he has a world to save.
He has a world to save and a previous boss to murder for his insolence.
Like it's just that like it's really just hard to have an omniscient character because you have no idea what's about to happen.
And like we were saying though, the way to combat that is to make sure that the character, I think one part is to limit what omniscient characters will give advice or readings about. Oftentimes, if you have that, like, you want to have that, like, prophetic character, future, they go and get their cards read or whatever, like, rarely let the characters ask for something, and instead give them something without their asking.
And give them, focus that reading less on sort of the character themselves, and focus it more on places they are going to go and events that are going to happen that you know are, for the sake of your campaign, more or less set in stone.
I think it's much better to instead of describing what is going to what could happen in the future, describe what has already happened in the story. Describe what is fact. It's just the fact that they haven't come across yet in their walk. And
that gives the impression of that, like, of this NPC, you know, glimpsing the future and or the character having visions of the future if their god or their patron is giving them like those visions, without worrying about, like,
them ballsing it up.
Yes, you know, or, you know, it's like well, what actually happened next was that character walked out of the building, picked a fight with a random NPC and just lost and died.
But turns out,
I told him he'd be a great king and have great, just unknowable riches.
But if instead what you described is the death of a king, and that's the king that they were going to replace when they got to that point in the story, that king's going to die either way. He doesn't have to be there to replace him, right, if he's just going to die. So that's a good way to show that. So I think the big key takeaways here are put the effort in that's necessary and valuable. In terms of building a pantheon and fleshing out gods.
If your gods are not going to be NPCs, you don't really need more than sort of names and domains.
If they are, stat them like you would stat an NPC, like not statistically, but emotionally, thought process wise. Like, make them characters, make them interesting. In terms of deities and stuff interacting with players as patrons when they're clerics, they're paladins, they're warlocks, whatever, make it matter. Make them directly interact and have positive outcomes of that with boons and quests, and negative outcomes with the pulling back of boons and powers for a player who's not following the right course of action in line with their deity. Not in a punishing way, but in a story-driven way.
Make your characters a part of that relationship, and make them feel a part of that relationship.
And if there's a all-powerful or an omnipotent, whatever kind of being directly interacting with the players, then do it right. Make sure that they are not solving problems and that they're not unsolvable problems themselves that they're creating. That their interactions are more vague, more loose, that are either overall benevolent and helpful but in a cryptic and non-direct way, or are unattached but unsettling and creepy without going in direct opposition to the players, so the players never feel like they're just hopelessly lost at ever solving a problem and not just outgunned in any problem they want to solve because their god could just show up and do it for them.
Difficult problems are fine. Unsolvable problems are no fun.
No fun at all. Very frustrating. I think that's a good place for us to stop. I think there's a lot of good usable advice there. Go ahead in the comments, describe your most interesting omnipotent NPC or your most interesting pantheon concept, because I really liked your idea of this, like, dualities concept. If you have an interesting pantheon you've used in one of your worlds, I'd love to see, like, a cool, unique idea for how you built yours. And I'm sure a lot of other people would too, to see how they could apply that to their own stories that they're getting ready to run. Thank you, everybody, for watching/listening. Hope you found this useful, and we will see you in the next one.
Here's an interesting bonus action brief discussion we can have.
Okay.
How many, because obviously there quite a few classes have ways to, like, you can use your intelligence. You know, you can, if you take this class, you can use intelligence for this. So you can, charisma's kind of the big one.
Yeah.
How many different sort of skills or saves or roles could you condense down into one skill through multi-classing? Because I get to the point where you're obviously making your charisma rolls. Your magic is charisma, and you could, and dipping into there's other charisma-based casters as well. Then you could get attack rolls to switch to charisma.
Yeah.
Could you go anything? Could you do anything?
I don't think there's anything that'll let you apply charisma to your armor class. I mean, you could.
It wouldn't surprise me if there was, though.
Yeah. Not that I'm aware of off the top of my head. I mean, there is like blade singers get to use intelligence. Get to have an intelligence like applied to their armor class when they're blade singing. I think you get to add their charisma modifier.
You can't.
Or their intelligence modifier.
You can't hit me. I'm too smart.
Exactly. Is there a way to use intelligence for attack and damage?
I mean, obviously with homebrew magic items there is.
I'm sure there is.
That was part of the thing with the fancy sword that... There are a lot of magic swords floating around in my original campaign. The one that you ended up with was, since it like kind of chooses its wielder, you get to choose what stat it uses. Mm-hmm. So you just chose intelligence.
Yeah. Because my character was Big Brain Boy. There's lots of ways to condense a majority of your things into two, but not into a single one. Like, that's the Dwarven Opera Hammer, is just like charisma and constitution. Mm-hmm. And you like use the dwarf so you can be in full plate, but not have to have a high enough strength to use full plate. And then your constitution is being not only your hit points, and then your charisma is your spellcasting and your attacking, because you use that dip into Hexblade. So that works.
Right.
And then you also have bards that you have lots of spells, and then you're also get do the Bard College of Swords, so you get all those charisma-based flourishes.
Well, and there's like Swashbuckler Rogue, which has a lot of charisma-based.
You could do
stuff.
One of my favorites is the Stone Sorcerer, which is Unearthed Arcana. It's never been canonized, it lets you like apply your Constitution as armor class, which is a pretty sweet thing to get to do for a caster.
That's a big deal.
Then you don't have to worry about Dex as a caster to have a decent AC, and they get like a big buff to their AC.
And obviously, it's like,
and they get 2 shields.
Unarmored defense, it's essentially the same thing, but barbarians are going to have a high con anyway, so it doesn't really like.
And then you can do like Dragon Sorcerer, which lets you have that like basically free mage armor.
Mm-hmm. I always thought Dragon Sorcerer was cool just because of that. Do they get a hit point?
I think they get
buff
+1
as well?
hit point per level too.
But Dragon Sorcerer is definitely the one of the few times that I've played like sorcerer multi-class in anything was what became the Gloomstalker Ranger. It was half Gloomstalker Ranger, half Dragon Sorcerer. That was with Wynn.
Which made a lot of sense for character reasons.
Which was fun. It was a very cool.
So the answer is probably yes. You can condense it down to like quite a few things down to 1. Certainly yes. You can condense almost everything down to like 2.
Yeah.
And then that's not even. I mean, the other nice thing is if you start combining stuff with Paladin, if you can find a way to combine that nicely, like dropping a Paladin's strength, if you did like a Dwarf Paladin, again, so you could have like that full plate, and dip it into Hexblade, so you could use Charisma for attack, as well as your spell casting, as well as your saving throws, because they get to apply their Charisma to all their saving throws.
Yeah, and then eventually, if you do enough in Paladin, everybody gets to apply.
Exactly. So you can just like fully spec into Charisma, and your AC will still be great because you're in full plate and a shield, and your attacks will be great, your spell casting will be great, your saving throws will be great. I think that's the biggest way you can like is that dip into Warlock with Paladin, and then you probably do Vengeance Paladin because you're an angsty Warlock Paladin.
Or do you go for something? Do you just try and? Is the whole point of the build to just be the ultimate, like, charming, smooth-talking, like pastor fellow? But he just...
You could do that, well...
He's also just in full plate and
just made a deal with a dark sword in a cave somewhere. But, like, if you did, like, the Redemption Paladin with that character, that's ridiculous to me, because they're all, like, very pacifisty and healy, and they're, like, all about defending their friends, so it's like... I am a man of peace. I did, however, I walk around with this staff because that's the peaceful man's weapon. I did, however, make a dark deal with a stick in a deep cavern of the Underdark. And should you challenge or should you threaten my friends, I will mega bonk you with double smite.
Tosses his staff aside, summons another staff.
Smacks someone with it. Double smites with the Warlock Smite and Paladin Smite. I mean, that character should exist. He should exist. And it's a dwarf too, so it's just a dwarf who used to be a miner and found a magic stick one day and made a dark deal with it. And it's a sword, it's a staff, a stick of violent peace. Peace by any means necessary.
It's a peace through superior firepower.
Exactly. It's a cold war until it's a hot one. Good bonus action. There you go. There's our advice for you. Play the mega violent paladin of peace.